time to get going. It's a little chilly in here today. Can't see your breath, which is it's not that chilly. But I think it'll warm up as we get into our class. So let's take a look. What's on our schedule for the week? We are talking about research that's being done into the personal and social influence of media. So this is social scientific research, some historical, some current, which is a different kind of knowledge base than we have been drawing on in other weeks when we've relied on journalists and industry observers to tell us about the electronic media as a business. So today we're going to dip into what the scientists have learned about it. Before we get into that, I want to explore the final optional topics for the research paper. Also, I should remind you that there is one more extra credit assignment which is available to folks who still have not maxed out their extra credits. So remember, there have been 4 of these over the last month or so. Each of them could be worth up to 50 points if you write 500 words on them. But you can only make a maximum of 100 points out of these extra credit assignments. So let's say if you did 2 of them and got your 100 points, that would be it. However, some people haven't done all of them. So, you haven't racked up your 100 if you want. So there is a final one due at the end of this week, Sunday night, which is related to the topic that we're discussing this week. We've always been trying to link those up to the topics that we've been discussing. So I promise not to confuse the issue by checking out the prompts. I would like to, in class, keep on talking about the actual assignment, the research paper number 2, but letting you know that there is the extra credit option there, and the prompt should be pretty straightforward for the extra credit assignments. If they're not, shoot me an email and maybe I can clarify, or of course there's always office hours and stuff. Notification, just see if anyone's asking a question. I don't know why we get these notifications. So on to the research papers. So just a reminder, we're looking for between 4 to 6 pages in length. That means at least 4 full pages, 12-point font, 1-inch margin. So it's very much the usual way that these papers look. If you use the textbook, you can simply cite the author and page number when you quote them or when you take some information from them, and it's a good idea to have at least one factual nugget in a research paper. If you go outside of the textbook for further information, I know I've been recommending Wikipedia as a starting place. For instance, if you're writing the biography of a radio station, Wikipedia is an excellent source of information to catch up on the history of a radio station here in the Bay Area, if that is the topic you chose. So you will be wanting to quote from Wikipedia using the correct style in the bibliography of your paper. Those are the basic guidelines. And also down here, the checklist is very useful. So you should have an academic structure in your essay. I've already taken a look at one, which was quite good and is on its way to being fantastic. Do you have an introduction where you state what was the prompt, what was the topic that you chose to write about, and what do you want to tell us about the topic? Have you organized the material effectively? So basically, as you write, going through and seeing, oh, okay, I have this bit about, the history of the station in 1960s. I should group it into a paragraph. I have sections about ownership. I have sections about format changes. So I shouldn't have that all spread and mixed together. I should separate that out and organize it. You have a central thesis, and so That's something that should appear in your introduction. It doesn't have to be like an earth-shattering, sophisticated thesis. In fact, very often the prompt will ask you a question, and your thesis can be an answer to that question. Again, if it's a radio biography, your thesis might be something like, when I looked at the history of KMEL, I was able to find evidence of changing organizational structure based on changes in policy in the 1990s, and also I see evidence of a formatting strategy on the part of the owners of the station group, or something like that, which we did explore in previous lectures. I'm not going to go over it again, but I mean, that would be a lot of findings for this research paper, just as long as you state it clearly and just in a sentence or two. Have you included relevant course materials as instructed in the assignments? So yes, if you can find some information in the textbook, that's you should cite it, put it in there. Do you provide a summary and conclusion? So at the end of your essay, good organization is always okay. When you finish, don't just stop at the end of your description, but come back around, write a paragraph, say, I believe that in my assignment I have learned more about KMEL and the various format changes and stuff. So summarize, conclude. You should have a bibliography in the back, unless all you have cited is the textbook. And then make sure you take out the worst spelling mistakes and stuff by proofreading it once and maybe giving it to a friend if you have a chance. That's it. And the required paper length, remember, minimum 4 pages. Okay. So this is general guidelines. Let's look at the topics that we haven't yet finalized on. Okay. So this first one at the top could be fun for somebody who watches a certain amount of broadcast TV, or someone whose parents watches a certain amount of broadcast TV. There's no reason that you have to be doing this regularly as well. I mean, you've got to do this quick little research, but maybe a chance to just watch a little TV with whoever does watch broadcast TV in your family. So this says, prepare an advertising profile of 3 different television programs from 3 genres and stations. And now that I launch into it, I realize I already told you about this one, right? So this one works best if you pick 3 very different genres, which is a fancy word for types of television show. So if you pick some sports, if you pick some political talk, if you pick some, entertainment drama, those are all crafted to reach very different audiences. If you go to Fox News, you're going to reach an older conservative audience. If you pick some sports, you'll be reaching a male audience of, anywhere between 18 and whatever. And if you pick, a big network drama, especially like a How to Get Away with Murder type thing, you'll be reaching a very broad audience that skews ever so slightly female. Now, the trick in this is, can you, looking at the commercials that are shown in the show, figure out who the target audience is? Because obviously the advertisers are targeting people who might buy their product. They know that those people are attracted to those particular shows, like men go to sports shows. And so, if they're targeting men, they will get into a sports show. And the idea is to, explore that and demonstrate by picking out a couple of ads that you see that play during the game or something like that and saying, hey, this is clearly, a product that targets that audience, and it makes sense that they would advertise it on a television show that attracts that type of audience rather than putting it on How to Get Away with Murder, where they'd be wasting their money compared to putting it onto a sports show. So, well, that was a quick review of one that I've already discussed, right? But I hope you'll consider that if you're into writing about television. Okay, so I see the last 2, which we haven't talked about yet. So here's the first of the last 2. Discuss the pros, cons, and implications of the proliferation of social networking tools being used in news reporting, such as blogs, Facebook, YouTube, Reddit, and Twitter. These so-called news sources have been credited with becoming a primary news source for many in younger demographic groups. Are these the new channels of news distribution, or merely a trend, or something else entirely? Your discussion should include recent events that have been impacted by social networking as a news source. So, wow. If you enjoy writing about fake news, if you follow, the many angles of this particular topic, whether it's about, foreign powers disseminating fake news in our social media, whether it's about the president going over the heads of the gatekeepers and tweeting his directives directly, and also tweeting links to fake news coming out of our very own government. If you are interested in, the fortunes of Facebook and these giant platforms which are having to contend with curating content, whereas they've been hands-off, but now news has it's become somewhat of their responsibility, it seems, to filter. Or if you are interested in the decline of the old news media and the rise of something, new, or not all old news media is declining, but most of it is. But maybe you want to focus on the positive survival stories and the great work that's being done by the Washington Post, the New York Times, even CNN of all places. So all of this could be stuff to bring in. Are these the new channels of news distribution, or merely a trend, or something else entirely? So as I said, you need a thesis. Perhaps your thesis could be, I argue that social media is the new channel of news distribution, that from here on in we should expect for news consumers to come upon stories mostly through recommendations, or either human recommendations or machine recommendations on social media. And how do you think that the news could be effectively curated or handled or presented in that type of situation? So that could be your argument. And obviously we don't expect you to cover every single recent event that is related to this, but you may, again, want to talk about what Facebook says it's doing to make news better, or talk about a recent event like recent hoaxes or misuse of news media on social networking. Just a couple of examples is enough for a 4 or 5 page paper. So, Chow, I know you've already decided on what you're doing. Gordon, any questions about? No? This isn't probably the one you're working on anyway. Okay. And then just to quickly run through the last possibility, and anybody who might have a question on chat, I don't know if yes, things are coming in. Good morning, folks. William asks, for the research papers on radio station history, should we be focusing on a set frequency, or should we follow call letters as they jump around? Good point. I mean, William, I would start with the call letters of a station which is currently operating, like KMEL, for instance. And those call letters don't change around as much as you would think, but what they do is they sometimes change branding, So it's relatively rare for call letters to change within a station identity. So that's my recommendation. Start on a station which is currently operating with its call letters, and then check its biography and see if you're interested in that. And primarily the focus is on changes of ownership and also changes of format. So changing the letters of the station, may be a branding operation that is connected to the station format changes as well. I mean, a station that calls itself The Bone is not likely to be, a country station, but The Wolf or something like that could well be a country station. So some of these name changes are branding related, and brand, of course, is closely connected to formatted radio. So, great question, William. Start out with a station that's already got its call letters out there. Just see how long they've persisted. Some of them, it's a matter of decades and decades. So, all right. I hope that was sufficient explanation there. So the final possibility is related to what we're talking about on Thursday this week. So it says your text, meaning your textbook, suggests that the bulk of prosocial programming appears on PBS. But the proliferation of children's programming on cable offers an opportunity for many other programs to offer positive programming as well. Watch a selection of kids shows from a variety of stations: Nickelodeon, Disney, Cartoon Network. What themes do you see? Is prosocial programming possible and present on the commercial cable nets, meaning networks? And if not, what themes and agendas are you able to identify that might be considered more negative in nature? And in this case, if you wanted to go on, Facebook or Hulu as well, looking for either off-network kids shows or network Netflix or Hulu originals, go right ahead. So the crux of this topic is that for a long time, people have thought that commercial programs that appear on Saturday morning TV or the equivalent now, the 24/7 kids cable channels, is not constructive for kids. It's not teaching them good things. It's not educating them. It's there to sell product. So there's been that prejudice for a long time. This prompt invites you to prove the opposite, basically. So your thesis here would probably be, there is some pro-social content programming off PBS on the commercial channels, be they cable or Netflix or whatever. And let me demonstrate, this would be your argument, let me demonstrate to you with a few examples, kids shows that are teaching good stuff, useful stuff to kids. So as you can see, this becomes a good thesis because it works against a lot of prejudice that is already out there about commercial programs. Excuse me. It may not come back, I don't know. Still a bit of a cold. Oh, that's better. Anybody thinking about doing this one? I don't know if you, yeah?
I have a question.
Josias, go ahead. Yeah.
Is this just for commercials or like the actual shows that they have?
This is for the shows.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So if you're interested in commercials, the first one at the top is a good one for, just what are the commercials that screen during these shows and who do you think they target? But in this case, it's about the kids' shows and the values that they promote. Yeah.
For the commercial one?
Yeah.
Does it have to be like on TV? Can it be like on Hulu? Like, how they have ads? Would that kind of work as well?
It could work. I just don't think you'll have as much a variety to pick from. So, now let me put it this way. If you want to do this and you don't have access to network TV, then go ahead and do it online. But why I think it would be easier to have to do this with access to network or to cable television or whatever, it's just there's a lot more ads and a lot more diversity of advertising. Because here the trick is basically to find the ads that clearly target a demographic. So if it's Viagra, you really know who's being targeted, right? But that may not show up on Hulu. You may not have enough ads in the show to make that easy or accomplishable. So that's why. But go ahead if you don't have a choice and this is the one you want to work on.
Okay.
Go ahead. It just may, take a little more ingenuity, but it's possible. So nobody in the room necessarily interested in the kids programming angle, but maybe people streaming either live now or picking this up a little later in the week would be interested here. So, the idea is, you could have a very commercial show or a show that's very successful, a SpongeBob or whatever, that, and you want to pick a show that is truly targeted towards children, not The Simpsons or something like that, which is, rather older in its approach. and what you're trying to demonstrate is that basically kids who are watching this are not just wasting their time. They might be learning good lessons about, how to get along with each other, or what's important in life, how to bounce back from a setback, how to, be a good friend, how to deal with friendships that evaporate, and all those kids stuff. Hey there. So this could be a fun one to do if you are still in touch with your inner child viewer or whatever, or if you have kids and you care about what they watch, which for me was a whole return back to this type of programming, and just being aware of basically how much more constructive a lot of kids programming is now. Don't be afraid to use this important word, prosocial. So we all know sometimes when we say about somebody that they're antisocial, that they don't want to, contribute to people getting along, basically, to society working out. Prosocial meaning it is good for the social, good for society. So it's the kind of values and stuff that are presented in shows which, somehow you feel could help people get along better by learning this and watching this. And once again, it's got a built-in thesis, because we expect, due to our prejudice, that, it's really only on PBS that we can guaranteed get those positive shows. But in fact, there's a lot of it is out there now on commercial networks as well. So see what you think. So any questions about any of these? Let's see, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. 5 possibilities. Any questions? You remember, you can always ask me after class, or 11 to 12 in Art X 170 is my office. That's Tuesday, Thursday. Besides, did I see a hand go up again? Nope. Yep.
This is doing the 6th, right?
Let's have a look. I changed stuff up so much in so many classes because, this is due on the 6th.
Okay.
But, so what's the 6th? End of the week, right? No, next class.
Yeah.
Nah, this will be, let's give this an extension to the 13th. I want to give you the weekend in order to work on this too. So hang on a second. Yeah, because of the canceled classes and stuff, I changed a lot of due dates, but it seems like I didn't change this one. So hang on, let's say, so I think we got to make it on the 11th. So let's put it on the 11th. And we got to move this as well. Let's put that there, just okay, because the exams are starting after that. Speaking of that, next week we're going to be reviewing for the finals. So it's already up here. I'll be refreshing this with the Kahoots today. So I like to get the sample exam questions and stuff up for us to practice on prior to the exam. So right now those Kahoot challenges have not been activated, but I will. So we are going to, review for the final next Tuesday. So I will try to get this up today. So if in advance you want to take a look at it, that'll be there for you. And then the final exam, Tuesday, December 18th, from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. here in this room. So it's gonna, well, there you go. 50 multiple choice questions. Like I said, we'll be reviewing on the 14th. I'm sorry, not the 14th, the 11th. Whatever day I said, the 11th. Okay, so. All right, I think we're, ready to move on to our final week of content. And boy, have we been through a lot. So, as I mentioned, topic this week is all about what the scientists can tell us about electronic media. So we've been, largely drawing on historians and journalists and stories told from people who are in the business. This is knowledge generated by social scientists who have looked at the media over the decades. And a lot of this is still pertinent. It's, maybe what we're starting out with is not cutting edge research, but it is somewhat reflective not only of what people used to think about media, but also what we still tend to assume about media. So this kind of research can help us reevaluate our assumptions. Concern about media effects is just about as old as the electronic media themselves. Obviously, the arrival of radio on the scene during the First World War was very influential. As a point-to-point communication medium, each side was sending encrypted messages around. It allowed, the coordination of troops and such. They also used media for propaganda purposes, for media influence during the First and Second World War. During the First World War, they were improving upon simply dumping leaflets on soldiers. They would fly over and just dump out tons and tons of leaflets. But there were also radio messaging going on. The takeaway from early radio was that it's sort of fearful in the sense that it was very powerful. It mass media, reached a lot of people, and also unstoppable in the sense that you could set up a radio transmitter and, just behind the lines, and you could disseminate your propaganda with no way for the other side to stop it. It would travel through the airwaves. If someone wanted to tune into it, they could get it. So this was a great concern to governments and to, they hired early media researchers to think about this. The first model that they generated was really very simple. It was the idea that the message could be injected into the audience like a hypodermic needle. In other words, if I create a propaganda message and people who are exposed to it instantly come away believing it. In this model, it didn't distinguish between people who might be more or less susceptible to the message. Everybody was equally affected. And it seemed like the media in this model was all powerful. There was no stopping it. So what would you think as a weakness of this model? Based on the idea that as soon as you hear the message, everybody is equally affected, and they are all, basically, they come away as believers. Hey, Gabe, what do you think is the downside of this? What do you think would disprove this, even in your own experience? Because this model is still what some people think. Well, the fact is, I think that in our current day and age, when we are exposed to media messages, we're not all affected equally. We, in fact, come away with different opinions about it. And very often, the message doesn't enter our brains like it was injected in there by a hypodermic needle at all. On the contrary, enormous efforts have to be made to constantly expose us to, information in order, just in the hopes of having us believe it. So this idea that the message would get to the receiver and just simply 100% of the time result in a successful communication, if you want. It just doesn't happen. So the hypodermic needle idea was too simple. And in fact, people who came afterwards started talking about it kind of as a joke, as the magic bullet. In other words, I got a message, boom, I shoot an advertisement at you, and you're convinced. If only it was so simple. Public relations and advertising, you know, would have a much easier time. So a little bit too simple. This was also, you know, same sort of model was current when people were thinking about propaganda at that time. So a quick definition of propaganda, which is simply communication, but it's kind of a special type of communication if you want, right? Because propaganda is just the sending of messages to receivers, right? But whereas when we talk about news, we tend to think about the sending of messages to receivers with some benefit to the receiver. You know, we're all citizens of the United States. The news should give us the truth so that we know what the government is doing and we can make an informed decision when we go to vote about them. Right? So that's the news, has the idea that the messages that are received have some kind of benefit to society and to the receiver. However, when just defining propaganda, the textbook says, well, propaganda is messages that are of greater benefit to the persuader. So in this case, propaganda, we could take, for example, the constant harping by President Trump that the news media is fake, that you mustn't trust what you read in things like the New York Times, etc. Again, if the magic bullet theory was operative, if we all believed what the president said and simply took it at face value, then he wouldn't have to constantly repeat that, you know, the news is all fake, this is a witch hunt, don't trust this, blah, blah, blah. So we can criticize that model, but at the same time, we must also remember that saying something over and over and over again, he has managed to convince a certain percentage of the population that the news media is wrong. It is full of fake news. And so although the magic bullet theory is too simple, where all people are affected equally, on the other hand, it's also too simple to simply dismiss it and say, well, this doesn't work at all. Because it does work. If you surround people with false information all the time, a good percentage of them will begin to believe it for sure. So propaganda works maybe more inexorably and also more selectively. So later media research attempted to be more sophisticated and subtle about the models that it used, and decided, okay, well, obviously media is not all powerful. When we do put out a bunch of messages, some people get it, some people reject it. So obviously media have their limitations. So we got to a paradigm of what they called limited effects. Yes, media is effective, definitely, but it's not all powerful. There are some limitations. So this is a very interesting set of research around the idea that it doesn't impact all audiences the same way. Audiences are actually involved in selective processes. So this gives the human being credit for being able to think a little bit more. The idea that we would select certain messages to expose ourselves and avoid others. In other words, we have a set of predispositions, a bunch of beliefs as humans that we come to any kind of communication, and we might choose not to expose ourselves to some information that we don't like. So can you think of any current examples in the electronic media where selective exposure is something that audiences do? or that they have the option to do if they want to. How does contemporary electronic media give people the possibility to avoid messages that they don't want to be exposed to? Yeah, Max?
Closing a tab or switching a channel.
Closing a tab, switching a channel, absolutely. So we have a lot of selectivity built in. And we also have certain promises from some media about what we're likely to see and hear. So, our partisan political media separate themselves out into, extremely conservative, mildly conservative, somewhat liberal. Depending on what channels you turn on, you're going to get 100% that point of view. And if you do run up against some alternative set of facts, you will, find it easy to dismiss them because everybody on that channel will be dismissing them too. And as Max is mentioning, same difference between cable TV or Reddit, and pick your subreddit or pick your, platform or your section of the platform. So we can definitely choose not to expose ourselves to stuff we don't want to hear now, much more so than in the days of the mass media where you got your news from one of 3 networks, and all of those networks were pretty much mainstream, sort of middle of the road, moderate, conservative. And in fact, they were legally required, if they aired a conservative view, to immediately afterwards contribute the same amount of broadcast time to a liberal point of view. So literally, you'd have a show, 60 Minutes had something called Point Counterpoint, where a conservative would talk for 5 minutes and then a liberal would talk for 5 minutes. That was called the Fairness Doctrine. And they eventually dropped it in the 1980s, which opened the door to Rush Limbaugh, to Fox News, to very partisan media. So there's an interesting question to ask here is, are all these selective processes allowing or promoting the kind of polarization we find where, there are conservatives just think that liberals are evil and vice versa, right? So also as human beings, we have our set of assumptions. We perceive things differently. So even if we are exposed to, in my case, conservative messaging, I will perceive it differently. I will be more critical. I will be ironic. I will be, so therefore less inclined to believe what they say. Selective retention. When experiments are done and we show, 1,000 or more people a tape full of different points of view, and then we ask them afterwards, which ones do you remember? What is the retention? They tend to select, in other words, to remember the stuff that conforms to their existing point of view. So selective retention means that if you believe something, you're going to remember that it was there more readily than if you don't, which kind of means that to get new information before somebody, to get something that contradicts their current beliefs, is very difficult. It's very difficult to change people's minds. They have this bias. Any thoughts about that? Any connections you could make to, our current polarization? Well, my own personal reflection on this is simply that I think that the polarization of our political spectrum, basically, where the government can't really work together too well because of its ideological separations, I think they're really being supported and, solidified by our media systems, which allow all of these selective processes to go on in a way that in the 50s and 60s, they really couldn't. Because our media was much less diversified and much less kind of separated out ideologically. It's kind of like the argument would be, if you can arrange a way so that our culture sorts itself into very, very opposed beliefs and views about everything, if you can do that by, through the media, creating that kind of divide, you are going to start to influence the way that people see stuff. Again, not the magic bullet, but the cumulative process has this kind of effect, I believe. Another model that was very influential regarding political communication was what was called the two-step flow. So remember the early hypodermic needle model, which they called the magic bullet, just had a sender and a receiver, right? And the idea was like 100% success? No way, right? But what they did have some success with in actual research is they found there would be a sender, and that would get to a person that they called the opinion leader, and the opinion leader would then talk to all of their friends. And they found that this had a much higher success rate. If what they counted in was what they called a two-step flow. Step number one was from the sender to the opinion leader. Step number two was from the opinion leader to everybody else. So they called that the two-step flow. And what they found is that the opinion followers were much more influenced by a real person that they knew than by, the antenna that was the network or whatever was out there. So can you see in our current media environment, which includes social media, so on and so forth, can you see a way that our media has become more like a two-step flow than the original mass media model of, sender to many receivers? What would be an example, for instance, of opinion leaders and opinion followers currently? This always existed, but now I think the media allows it much more. Any ideas? Next?
I would say a good example of that would be like when a popular celebrity, for example, let's pick one of the Jenner kids, promotes some sort of, maybe it's a piece of clothing, maybe it's a product on their Instagram or Facebook or Snapchat. I don't know if they use Facebook. And then everyone follows that.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. Opinion leaders now, a good example of opinion leaders would be a celebrity now. Absolutely. And so you get that where perhaps, Louis Vuitton could put all the advertising they want and all the fancy magazines they want. They won't do as well as, giving away 100 bags to 100 celebrities and just allowing them to shoot a shot and say, hey, look at the bag I got from Louis Vuitton, amazing. And they spread it out to 10,000 people who feel they have a kind of a personal connection with the opinion leader. So I see there some, really interesting commentary on what our current media can do for us. And it's not just celebrities. It could also be, a Facebook influencer or an Instagram influencer who has, 10,000 or more followers or something like that. So they're not necessarily a name brand celebrity like a Jenner, but they're, nonetheless influential in their little area, And so because of the social media structure, it allows for this type of promotion to happen. And I think advertisers are spending a lot more time and attention on, these, different ways of advertising, influence-based advertising, sometimes called organic advertising as well. The idea that you can get people to do the talking for you who are much more influential. So although this was a two-step flow was a model that came from the 1950s of political research, I think it's even more relevant now. So those were a couple of ideas that came out of the notion that media is influential, but that it has limited effects. And then if we can look at further developments in the 1960s, where media researchers looked at not political influence, but certain themes which still concern us today, such as the effects that violent TV has on viewers, and also the effect that advertising has on younger viewers especially as well. So there was a concern for kids. The idea again that not everybody is affected in the same way by a message, that we ought maybe to protect younger viewers who are less sophisticated. And so in the 1960s, there are new laws created to protect kids from, egregious advertising on TV with, oh, buy the latest toy, it will make you Superman, you can fly, look, the kid jumps out the window and stuff like that. So you definitely don't want to do that. And yet, these are scientists, right? So obviously we can assume that media will have influence, but they wanted to test it out. So Albert Bandura had a notion and created a series of experiments based around what he called modeling theory, which was this. They would put a Bobo doll, like a plastic, those punching dolls that little kids have they got sand in the bottom so that they'll fall over and come back up, and they're inflatable, you blow them up, and the kids punch them. So what Bandura did was, and this was like with the controlled samples and stuff, brought little kids in, showed some of them videos of kids punching out a punching bag, and then immediately afterwards putting the kid in a room and saying, yeah, just wait a sec, your mom will be in a second, and watch, because in the room there's a Bobo doll. Does the kid go over and punch out the Bobo doll after they've seen a video of a kid punching out a Bobo doll? If they, so basically compare the kids who have seen the video and the kids who haven't seen the video. Is there a difference in what they do when you put them in the room by themselves? And yes, there was. The kids who had seen another kid punch out the Bobo doll in the video would much more often go over and punch out the Bobo doll in real life while they waited for their mom. So it was a proof of what Bandura called modeling theory. What you see in the media, you model in your own life. And it worked on kids with Bobo dolls, but I think sometimes you can see certain trends in clothing or in, even physical behavior where people seem to eagerly model what they see in the media as well. So that leads us, to the need for further experiments to see just how far will this go. Will we model really awful behavior that we see, in the media or not? And of course, it's complex. People are complex. You could say that when a bunch of right-wingers get together in a city, is it the media messages they're getting which tells them that it's okay to go on sort of a racist parade, or is it the influence of each other being there? And then, of course, nowadays through social media, all of this might be mediated too. So it gets more complicated. But there is definitely proof that we will model media messages when we see them. We just don't know what the limits are to that. Right? So that's why they call these moderate effects. We know there's some kind of an effect, but we're not sure exactly. And in all of this, the difference is these are scientists. They're actually trying to prove stuff. They're trying to get to a point where they've got a reliable, repeatable phenomenon that they can talk about, and that is elusive. People are so complex, and society is complex. We may find some proofs of modeling, and yet now we know that it works sometimes, but to what extent? When will people, not model all of that? Has anybody heard of any of the, there's a couple of really famous psychological experiments from the 1960s, for instance, one where they put two groups of students into like a week-long simulation of a prison. Some were made to be guards, some were made to be prisoners. Did you ever hear about any of that? Or another test where they would put a person, they would tell them, you'd have a researcher, and you would have an actor who was, behind a partition, and the researcher would tell the subject, the person coming in, they'd say, okay, we're doing some tests to see, how people can withstand pain. And here's this little dial, and when you turn it up, you'll send an electric shock to the person behind the partition, and we just want to see how much this person will handle or whatever. So the actual experiment is to see how the person thinks they're helping out with the experiment. They're trying to see whether that person will obey authority. To what extent will they obey authority? So they get them cranking up the dial, and the actor is not really being electrocuted, but the actor is going, whoa, ah, and just seeing how far the person will turn it up. Anybody heard of any of these? Yeah? Were you a little shocked, basically?
Yeah. I remember the Stanford prison experiment.
Yeah.
They made that movie of it, and it just shows how people, when they think they have authority, what they would actually do to prove it.
Yeah, right. So in the Stanford, by the end of the week, I think they had to call it off.
Yeah, it wasn't supposed to be way longer.
I think so. Yeah. And then the guards were actually beating the prisoners. And these are all just students who are simulating their roles, but the student prisoners were getting unruly and whatever, and then the student guards were trying to exercise authority, and they started getting in fights and stuff. So they called it off. Yeah. And they found with the other experiment that a lot of people were willing to give the full charge. Rather than to say no to the authority figure, who was the quote-unquote psychologist who was telling them to turn up the pain, they would just do it. So these are very, very interesting kind of psychological experiments into, the role of authority and how we respond to it. So this is a type of knowledge that's being sought out here, just pushing and seeing, well, how influential will these messages be? Will people actually believe? Will they act on their beliefs, or are they at some point going to, not go all the way and model aggressive behavior that they see, for instance? So there have been, a series of government-promoted research into antisocial behavior and violent behavior, and sort of the best that they have come up with so far, I don't know about the best, but the most conclusive statement that they can make so far is that even children who do not sort of rate aggressive on the various personality tests that exist out there are likely to become more aggressive when exposed to TV violence to model it. Now, again, that's not to say that they're going to go out and shoot anybody or even start a fight. There are all kinds of other kind of socially learned, factors that might limit this, but they have been able to see this. And certainly, kids who are predisposed to aggressive behavior, in other words, who rate higher. And we've all known kids who are more likely to get into fights or who are more dominant in their classrooms or something like that. Those kids respond even more, they model even more readily aggressive behavior when they see it on TV. So again, depending on what you're predisposed to, you have a different kind of reaction. So, let's skip over obscenity and those things. If they're interesting, we'll come back to it. Let's look more into the later research, continue on with this theme of television violence, because it really has concerned people and researchers, of course, and government. And of course, we always have a fear that modeling may happen if kids see, for instance, or if anybody sees, we have on a weekly basis mass shootings, and God forbid that they continue, but they quite possibly will. There's always a fear of kind of copycat behavior, which is basically modeling behavior. And there's also been a good deal of criticism of violent content on TV, but especially video games, that constantly gets surfaced again. It's like, oh, the latest mass shooting happens. Was it somebody? Was it a young person who played a lot of violent video games? I mean, that was a pretty automatic question that was asked, leading to some assumptions. Nowadays, it seems more like, was it a crazy, right winger or something like that? But the media has been sometimes blamed based on our ideas about modeling and that kind of influence. So in the 90s, some studies were done, because basically what you've got to do is get a sense, if you want to talk about social effects, you need to have pretty clear data about society and the amount of violence that goes on there, and also an understanding of how much violent content people are exposed to. And that in itself is difficult stuff to study. So part of the data that was gathered in the 90s was just to say, look, 60% of TV shows have violent incidents. On TV, 70% of people get away with it. 40% of violent acts are initiated by attractive role models. So there's a lot more kind of punching out that happens done by heroes. 40% of violent scenes include humor. So again, whereas in real life this might be quite serious and traumatic, a lot of what you see on TV is treated as a joke. Some of these half-violent scenes show pain and harm, but that means the other half doesn't. And less than 5% of violent programs feature anti-violence messages. So, in doing the content analysis of the television shows, which is absolutely necessary to prove anything, the takeaway is, wow, it's pretty violent. It's pretty unrealistic as to the outcomes of violence. People watching TV might think that there's a whole lot less damage done to people physically and emotionally. And there's very little effort put into promoting, a message which contradicts these ideas about violence. So this is all work that's being called content analysis, which means that there are large groups of graduate students who sit down in front of, pre-recorded television files, and they go through them and they note down exactly what happens. So in order to make this scientific, an enormous amount of work goes into it. We can sit back here and say, yeah, it's violent. I see a lot of violence on TV. To actually prove that requires great resources. So the communications department at Stanford has done some very serious content analysis of news. And I wanted to just show you a video of George Gerdner's work. There we go. So a longtime researcher at Stanford, and gosh, unfortunately there are so we have trailers. I'm looking for something like a 5-minute trailer. Okay, this is the one that I want. It seems to be pretty poor quality, but it'll be all right. So, and we want to go full screen on this, of course. As I said, research regarding actual media influence of violent programming has been inconclusive, in the sense that we know that modeling is a fact, but we don't know the limitations of modeling. And that has, we've reached a bit of a dead end in that in that pursuit. George Gerbner at Stanford took a different approach, which came out of decades of looking at media violence and thinking about what the data is telling him and what the best way to interpret it is. And so what Gerbner focused on more was the cumulative effect of what we saw on television, that you're seeing so much violence on TV. We've run into limits as to explaining overtly violent acts based on exposure to media. But what Gerbner says is there's a much more subtle effect coming out. So it's still a media effect, but it's much less direct. So this is what he called the mean world syndrome, and it's explained in this video. I hope, with sound, would be good.
The effects of the mean world syndrome don't stop here, with fear and anxiety and a heightened state of alert in response to perceived threats. On the other side of this anxious state, cultivation analysis has also pointed to the paradox of high media exposure.
Okay, wait a sec. So, as I said, there's a bunch here, and this is the guy, definitely. This is the document, but it seems that it doesn't start exactly where I would want it to start. So hang on a sec. Let's just back up and see if... This is last. Just see the playlist.
Ever since Hollywood added sound to the movies in the late 1920s, debate has raged about the impact of violent media on our minds and our behavior. Hundreds of studies and countless congressional hearings have looked at the issue of media violence.
Does anyone disagree with that conclusion that your violence in films propagates violent conduct on behalf of the children?
Violence in the entertainment is causing increased aggressive behavior among some children.
But this is really trivial. The contribution of television violence into the actual committing of violence is practically negligible.
For all the endless debate, a basic question remains. Is the issue really about whether we imitate what we see? And if that's the case, why do the vast majority of us watch TV and never commit a violent act? This film looks at the work of a man who took a more complicated look at the issue of media violence. And what he found was as remarkable as it was simple. Not that consuming media violence is likely to make us violent, but something else entirely. That it's likely to make us more scared of violence being done to us.
Well, there's the teaser. I promise that next class I'll have it all for you. But just because, I don't want to send you home with just the teaser. What Gerbner's managed to show very carefully through his research is that, as he says, the contribution of TV violence to real violence is negligible. But what they have shown is that the more that people watch television, the more their perception of the world is that it's mean, that it's dangerous, that violence might happen to them. Because, we are not brilliantly equipped to just, separate our real life from the life that we perceive on media. but that the life that we perceive on media subtly comes in and influences our belief about real life. People who watch a lot of television, where there are a lot of violent acts, tend to think that they're going to be attacked, or that it's more likely that something violent will happen to them. It makes them fearful. So people who watch a lot of TV are more fearful about what society actually is. In addition to that, Gerbner demonstrates that the actual crime rates in our society have been going down, especially homicide, especially these types of violent crimes have been declining for several decades. But the research surveys they do on audiences suggest the opposite. Audiences think the world is becoming more and more violent and dangerous around them, while actually violent acts are on the decline. So again, it's kind of like a contradiction. Although facts show us that things are getting a little bit safer, not in every neighborhood, obviously, but in the United States as a country as a whole, things are getting safer. But people believe, more and more through the media that some violence might befall them, some kind of violent act. So maybe next class we can look in a little bit more to Gerbner explaining his work himself. But it is, again, a more subtle view of what television violence does. Can anybody think about any current examples where the media is being used to make us feel like the world is, a scarier place?
Any news station?
Any news station? Yeah, in a way, local news is, the cliche is if it bleeds, it leads, right? So, yep. Yesterday, unfortunately, we heard that the event was unfortunate, that someone was shot at 16th and Valencia. And initial reports on the news was just like somebody got shot. They had nothing else to tell us, not who it was, not how it happened, not the police were doing anything, it's just somebody got shot. That was like the first thing when I was in the office yesterday after class, and one of my colleagues listens to a lot of news. Well, it's just like, okay. On a national scale, have we tried to make the population fearful about anything recently that you're aware of? No? Why did we send 5,000 troops to the border? Nope.
Immigration.
To protect our country against,
Criminals.
a quote-unquote, a column of people who are actually traveling together as a group to avoid being hurt themselves, because they're very vulnerable as they, walk from Honduras to try to get into the United States. But the president felt that required 5,000 U.S. combat troops at the border to make sure that, they couldn't cross. And now he's asked that we change the laws so that those troops can use deadly force within the United States in order to defend us from a bunch of people with no shoes who are desperately just trying to come. So there's definitely a conscious manipulation of perception through the media again, which if you go back to our definition of propaganda, it's of greater benefit to those trying to persuade us that things are really, really dangerous, that whole kind of picture is being presented to us. But I think Gerbner might point out that television and the media being what they are, the audience is much more primed to believe that the world is dangerous in that way than they might otherwise be if they didn't constantly see news reports about criminals, terrorists, etc. So, and in fact, again, some of the social media representations of the whole event were actually using news videos that came from something completely unrelated. Some guy with blood all over his forehead and stuff. It had nothing to do with it, but that's what they were leading with visually, because it was very impactful. So, well, thank you for today. So on Thursday, we'll just let Gerbner tell his story a little more, and then we can move on also to talk about profane content, things like that has also been studied. Okay, thanks.